episode 2 of my series on who wrote the Bible. Today I'll be covering what we Jews call the Nevi'im. This section includes Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12 minor prophets. In addition to looking at who wrote each book, I'll also be placing each author on a timeline. And you might be surprised when you find out which books are actually most likely to have been written first. So in episode 1, we learned that what Christians call the Old Testament is actually pretty much the same thing as what we Jews simply call the Bible, or the Tanakh. And in both cases, the first 5 books are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Jews call these first 5 books the Torah, whereas Christians call them the Pentateuch. But basically, they are exactly the same. Now, like I say, the rest of the Tanakh and the rest of the Old Testament is pretty much the same too. I say pretty much because there are 2 main differences. First, the order of the books is slightly different. And second, if you're reading a Catholic or Eastern Orthodox Old Testament, there are going to be a few extra books. This is something I forgot to mention in episode 1. But regardless of whether you are reading a Protestant Bible or a Catholic Bible, Christians usually divide the Old Testament into 4 sections. After the Pentateuch, you get history, poetry, and prophecy. The history section has 12 books, although Catholics include an additional 4. I've shown these books slightly shaded. Poetry has 5 books, 7 if you're Catholic, and prophecy has either 17 or 18. So in total, there are 39 books in the Protestant version and 46 books in the Catholic version. Let me now explain to you how the Jewish Bible is slightly different from the 2 Christian versions. First off, the 7 Catholic books, which are usually referred to as the Apocrypha, are not included. However, keep in mind that those 7 books were in fact written by Jews and are considered by Jews to be important books of Jewish literature. But they are not official parts of the Jewish Bible. We'll be looking at them in episode 4 of this series. However, everything else you see listed on the Old Testament side is included in the Jewish Bible. It's just that the order and categorization is slightly different. In the Jewish Bible, there are only 3 sections, not 4. In Hebrew, these are called the Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, which is why the Jews call their Bible the Tanakh, TNK being an acronym for the 3 sections. Note that Nevi'im simply means prophets, and Ketuvim means writings. So in the Jewish Bible, like in the Old Testament, you get the Torah first, followed immediately by Joshua and Judges. However, Ruth is placed in the Ketuvim. 1st and 2nd Samuel are combined into a single book, as is 1st and 2nd Kings. And then everything else in the history and poetry section of the Old Testament, as well as Lamentations and Daniel, are placed in the Jewish Ketuvim. That leaves 15 remaining books, all from the prophecy section. In the Jewish Bible, the Book of Kings is followed by the big 3 prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. And then finally, the remaining 12 books, all of which are quite small in comparison, are combined together into a single book called the 12. So in this episode, it is these 8 books in the Jewish Nevi'im that we're going to focus on. But keep in mind that all of this material is in fact included in the Christian Old Testament as well. So, who wrote these books and when? Well, according to tradition, you can find the answer simply by considering the name of each book. So, for example, Joshua was traditionally said to have been written by Joshua, and Isaiah by Isaiah. Judges and Kings, of course, are not personal names, so they're a bit more tricky, but Basically, tradition states that Judges was written by Samuel and Kings was written by Jeremiah. But, as you might have guessed, from a historical point of view, things are a bit more complicated. To explain, let's quickly review what we learned about the Torah in episode 1. Although there are several different theories and the details are still being worked out, most scholars today believe that the Torah was pieced together from the work of 4 different authors, or schools of authors. These are labeled J, E, P, and D. Genesis is primarily a mix of J and P. Exodus is mostly E and P. Leviticus is entirely P. Numbers is also P, with a little E near the end. And Deuteronomy is entirely D. Let's now place the first 4 books of the Nevi'im next to the Torah. These 4 books are sometimes called the former prophets. According to most scholars, these 4 books were written by D, or to put it more accurately, by someone from the Deuteronomist school who attempted to explain the history of Israel and Judah according to the lens given in the book of Deuteronomy. You may remember that the core part of Deuteronomy is thought to have been written during the reign of King Josiah, during a time when many refugees from the northern kingdom of Israel were now settled in and an integral part of the southern kingdom of Judah. So it's likely that the bulk of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings were all written during this period as well, which is why the story they tell seems to build towards and culminate in the reign of King Josiah, a boy king who was supposedly reintroduced to a lost law code. However, please note that the 5 books shown here in blue, all written by the Deuteronomist school, were not fully completed during the reign of Josiah. In fact, scholars think that there are at least 2 layers within D, the first being written during Josiah's time, and the second being written later, after the fall to Babylon. And I should also point out that we can further divide the D material by some of the original sources that it initially relied upon. For example, within Deuteronomy is a section that stands out as being a complete document unto itself. This is known as the Deuteronomic Code and can be found in chapters 12 through 26. This law code may have existed as a unit prior to the time of Josiah and may have been the document that was supposedly found by priests and presented to the king. It is distinct from 2 other law codes that can also be found in the Torah. I didn't mention it in episode 1, but the priestly source actually contains a distinct unit called the Holiness Code that may be older than the priestly source itself. It can be found in Leviticus 17 through 26 and is sometimes considered as a separate source, labeled H. Finally, there's the Covenant Code, considered part of E, found in Exodus chapters 20 to 23. But back to the former prophets. The book of Samuel appears to be centered around 2 story arcs, both of which may have originally existed as separate documents. These are often called the accession history of King David and the court history of King David. In a similar manner, the Book of Kings appears to rely heavily on 2 previous documents, now lost, known as the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel and the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah. Note that these are not the same as 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which we'll be talking about in the next episode. Joshua and Judges are likely based on many sources. One of these is a hymn known as the Song of Deborah, found in Judges chapter 5, verses 2 to 31. Based on its grammar, some scholars believe it to be one of the oldest texts in the entire Hebrew Bible. Interestingly, it names 9 Israelite tribes instead of the usual 12. I should also point out a source that is mentioned in the book of Joshua and several other places. This is the book of Jasher. Although there are several books available today that claim to be the original book of Jasher, these have all been demonstrated by scholars to either be deliberate forgeries or works written during the Middle Ages. The original book of Jasher is unfortunately lost. So, as you can see, the Bible has many layers. Parts were combined with other parts, and then those combined parts were put together with other combined parts to make even longer parts, and so on. The final result in this part of the Hebrew Bible was 9 books that tell the complete history of the Israelite people, from the creation of the world to the fall of Jerusalem. Now, whether or not these first 9 books were ever thought of as a single unit is something that is up for debate, but it certainly seems like a good possibility, because although it is comprised of many sources, the way it was put together does seem to have a certain thoughtfulness to it. Okay, let's now look at the rest of the prophets section, sometimes called the latter prophets. In order to do that, I'm going to use a timeline. Several people commented on episode 1 that I should have included dates, so I'm going to make sure that I include dates this time. As you can see, this timeline is divided into 4 main periods. The first period goes from 850 to 722 BCE, and I've labeled it the dual monarchies period. During this period, there were 2 Israelite kingdoms, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. I use 850 as the starting point because this is approximately when the 2 kingdoms first appear in the archaeological record. And I use 722 as the end point because this is when the northern kingdom fell to the Assyrians. So from 722 to 586 BCE, there was only 1 Israelite kingdom, the kingdom of Judah. But in 586, Jerusalem and the first temple were destroyed by the Babylonians, and some of the Judahites were forced into exile. The third period begins in 539 BCE, after Babylon was conquered by Cyrus the Great. Judah was now under the control of Persia, and the Jews were allowed to return and rebuild their temple. That new temple is usually referred to as the Second Temple. Finally, in 331 BCE, Alexander the Great bursted onto the scene, and Judea came under Greek rule. This lasted until 167 BCE, when the Jews rebelled and finally achieved independence again under the Maccabees. So let's start by adding the Torah to the timeline. But remember, there are several different theories about when the various parts of the Torah were written. So keep in mind that what I'm showing here is just one of the possibilities. Here, we're going to assume that J and E were perhaps written during the dual monarchies period, and that P was written after the exile. What almost every biblical scholar does agree on is that D can be firmly placed in the single monarchy period during the reign of King Josiah. And as we just learned, this is when the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings were likely written as well. Although remember that this was a process that was likely not finished until after the fall of Jerusalem. Okay, let's now talk about the remaining books in the Nevi'im. The first is the book of Isaiah, supposedly written by the prophet Isaiah. What almost every scholar agrees upon, though, is that the book of Isaiah can be divided into at least 2 parts. The first part, chapters 1 through 39, was likely written by the original Isaiah, often called First Isaiah, who lived near the end of the dual monarchies period. However, the second part, chapters 40 to 66, was likely written by a follower of his school of thought, who lived during the Babylonian exile and shortly thereafter. This author, or more likely group of authors, is usually called Second Isaiah, although sometimes 2nd Isaiah is divided into a 2nd and 3rd Isaiah. So in other words, the book of Isaiah is more the work of a school of authors rather than of a single prophet. This is why it deals with both the fall of the northern kingdom and then the fall of the southern kingdom. Now, before I move on, I want to mention something else about the book of Isaiah, because it's likely to come up in the comments. As many of you know, I'm Jewish. And one of the questions that Christians love to ask Jews is, how do you explain the verses in Isaiah which obviously refer to Jesus? Here are just 2 examples of what they're talking about. Feel free to pause and have a quick read. So, yeah, at first glance, to anyone familiar with the Jesus story, these verses do seem to be referring to the birth and death of Jesus, events that would happen hundreds of years after the book of Isaiah was written. So to Christians, these are obvious prophecies about Jesus. Now, I'm not going to argue that Christians are wrong. If you're a Christian and you believe that these verses refer to Jesus, that's fine. I understand that that's a key part of your religious faith. However, what I will take issue with is the idea that there is no other way to explain these verses, and that Jews purposely avoid talking about them. That's simply not true. From a historical point of view, Isaiah 7:14 was likely written by 1st Isaiah and was addressed to King Ahaz of Judah. The word virgin is better translated as young woman, and the son is probably a reference to Ahaz's son Hezekiah, who became the next king and who ended up defending Judah against the Assyrians. Isaiah chapter 53 was likely written many decades later by 2nd Isaiah. It is part of a series of poems known as the servant songs. According to Jews, the suffering servant described in these poems is not Jesus, but rather the people of Israel as a whole. There are several verses throughout the book of Isaiah, like this one, that back this up. So yeah, it's up to you how you want to interpret those scriptures, but please know that there are several options available. Let's now return to the timeline and discuss the next prophet, Jeremiah. Unlike Isaiah, who was a member of Judah's royal family, Jeremiah came from a priestly family. In fact, his father was likely Hilkiah, the high priest under King Josiah. This places Jeremiah around the time of Jerusalem's fall and squarely within the Deuteronomist school. In fact, from a literary point of view, there are many stylistic similarities between Jeremiah, the D source, and Joshua through Kings. Next up is Ezekiel, a slightly younger contemporary of Jeremiah. He too lived through the fall of Jerusalem, and in fact was one of the people who ended up in exile in Babylon. But unlike Isaiah and Jeremiah, it is thought that he probably didn't write any of the book that bears his name. Instead, the book of Ezekiel was likely written by some of his followers during the Persian period. In the same way that Jeremiah has strong literary associations with D, Ezekiel has strong literary associations with P. So it seems that whoever wrote the book of Ezekiel was probably part of the same school of priests who wrote the priestly source. Okay, so that covers the big 3 prophets. Note that Christians call these 3 the major prophets and include Daniel alongside them. However, note that for Jews, Daniel is not considered a prophet, and the book that bears his name is included in the writings, which I'll be covering in episode 3. For this episode, that leaves us with the minor prophets. Like I mentioned earlier, the 12 minor prophets are included in the Jewish Bible as a single book called the 12. But in the Christian Old Testament, they are considered 12 separate books. For our purposes here, I'm going to quickly consider each one separately and place them on the timeline in chronological order. First up is Hosea and Amos. In terms of complete books, these two are likely the two oldest books in the entire Bible, which may come as a surprise to you as they are placed nowhere near the beginning. They were written a little earlier than 1st Isaiah, probably by two individuals who were in fact named Hosea and Amos. It is from the book of Amos that Martin Luther King Jr. quotes in his I Have a Dream speech, when he says, "Until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream." Chronologically, next up comes Micah and Zephaniah, two books that are often associated with Isaiah, and therefore perhaps best fit as part of the Isaiah school. Note that the minor prophets are called minor, not because they are less important, but because they tend to be quite short. This means that most of them are likely the work of a single author, a historical person who matches the name of the book. But keep in mind that even in the case of the minor prophets, there are sometimes sections of each book that were likely added later by someone else. Micah is a good example of this. Although most of it was written by an actual Micah in the dual monarchies period, some parts were written much later, during or after the Babylonian exile. Okay, next up comes Nahum and Habakkuk, both of which were likely written late in the single monarchy period, during the transition between Assyrian dominance and Babylonian dominance. In fact, neither book is about the Israelites. Nahum is primarily about Assyria, and Habakkuk is primarily about Babylon. We then get Obadiah, who was likely a member of the Deuteronomist school. His book is the shortest in the entire Old Testament and relates to the kingdom of Edom. Next, we get Zechariah, whose work shares some similarity to Ezekiel's, and Haggai, both of whom wrote during the Persian period. We then get two books that are rather difficult to place. There's Jonah, which is more of a story than a prophetic book. Although the book of Jonah centers around a character named Jonah, who supposedly lived sometime during the single monarchy period when Assyria was still the dominant power, most scholars today consider it to be a work of fiction, written late in the Persian period. And then there's Joel, whose prophecy is very general and which includes very little context. It too was likely written late in the Persian period, mirroring the style of earlier prophets. Last but not least, we have Malachi. Whereas Muslims call Muhammad the seal of the prophets, for Jews it is Malachi who is considered to be the final prophet. The name Malachi simply means messenger, so it's unclear whether or not Malachi was actually a real name or simply a way to keep the book anonymous. Okay, so that concludes the placement of the 12 minor prophets, as well as all of the other books of the Nevi'im. In the next episode, we'll take a look at the final section of the Jewish Bible, the Ketuvim, or writings.